We will get started in elevation certificates since we are 2 minutes past the hour. And if everyone could just remember to please mute your phone, that would be greatly appreciated. So we will go ahead and get started.
No, I'm not.
Right. If my computer will cooperate. There we go. We're going to decode elevation certificates today. We're going to talk about the 3 W's of elevation certificates, common application errors, and elevation certificates section by section. And I promise I'm going to try not to put you to sleep. Elevation certificates are very tricky, and oftentimes you're not sure when you need one, how you get one, where to find it, all of those things, and it can be rather frustrating not only for you and your customer. So we want to make sure that we walk through some of the basics today and give you some information to work with. When do you need an elevation certificate? It's required on what we call post-firm construction in high risk A as in apple or V as in Victor flood zone. Post-firm means the structure was built after the community entered the floodplain National Flood Insurance Program. I apologize. So when a community decides they're going to join the National Flood Insurance Program, they now must adhere to new floodplain management rules and guidelines, and that goes for new home or building construction. The way we monitor that construction or following those rules is with the use of an elevation certificate. That's how FEMA makes sure that the community is following those rules. Unfortunately, the ownership of purchasing an elevation certificate falls on the property owner, not the community official. So when you're actually quoting a policy and you enter the date of construction, based on the flood zone information the system generates, it's automatically going to tell you if it's pre-firm or post-firm. That's not something you need to know. But it's important to know why newer construction in high-risk flood zone need one, and then the older construction does not. And if it ever helps you remember, A stands for the accumulation of water, so inland flooding where water accumulates, and V stands for the velocity of water. So that's going to be your storm surge and high-risk flood zones that you find along the coast. Who can complete an elevation certificate? And these can be completed by licensed surveyors, engineers, or architects. It does vary by state. Oftentimes a surveyor is probably the easiest place to obtain a completed elevation certificate. In my experience, they can range anywhere from $250 to have completed anywhere up to $2,000. So it really just depends on the area where you live, the topography of the land that they're looking to survey, etc. In some very rare cases, homeowners or property owners can actually fill out an elevation certificate themselves. That always makes me incredibly nervous because we're going to rate that house or that structure based on the elevations we're provided. Not to say that the person would intentionally do it wrong, but I'd hate to see someone accidentally give themselves a negative elevation because they weren't sure how to fill out the form. And then we rate that accordingly and they have a very high premium. So that's always something that it is absolutely available, and we have tools and tips to help someone through that. FEMA also provides tips. Just always makes me a little nervous. And some communities may also hold copies with their floodplain management offices. So it's important to note that elevation certificates remain with the property regardless of who owns that house or building. So even if a prior owner had an elevation certificate completed, I can still use that as the new or current homeowner if the information is still matching what the property or the building actually looks like. So if one's already been done, even if the names at the top of the elevation certificate don't match, we can still use that. It's also important to note that older elevation certificates are also lacking some important information for rating. So sometimes when you're working with an older elevation certificate, you'll find that underwriting may ask you some follow-up questions or for additional photos so that we can accurately rate that home or property today. And why do we need them, or why are they used? And again, it's what FEMA uses to police the communities to make sure that they're following those new floodplain management guidelines and building codes. You know, if a home was built or a building was built back in 1950, prior to the National Flood Insurance Program, there were no rules and regulations in place to make sure people followed them. So there are no pre-firm guidelines on elevation certificates on those older structures. But after 1974, when the NFIP was enacted, communities joined in different years. And that firm date or that birth date, the date the community entered the flood program, is when those new rules take place, and why it's so important to make sure that those post-firm structures have elevation certificates.
Hey, Courtney, we have a question in the chat box. How would you be able to obtain a prior elevation certificate?
That's a great question. So you can try your local auditors or city engineer's office. Sometimes they keep it with the property deed or other property information on file. Down south in Florida, we're super lucky when we get on those sites because they actually have them on the auditor's page under the property. I know the city of Charleston, South Carolina does a fairly decent job keeping them on hand as well. So it's very driven by the floodplain manager or flood office in each community. I always start there, or start at the city office, start with the property owner and check with homeowner's paperwork you get when you buy a home. But I'll be honest, sometimes it can feel a little bit like a wild goose chase. And you may exhaust all of these options, and at the end of the day, the insured may end up having to have a new one done, unfortunately. But if you ever get stuck on one of those and need ideas or want to brainstorm places you can check, please let us know and we can walk you through that as well. So you'll see here the current elevation certificate is 4 pages long, but the first 2 pages are what we're going to use to rate the policy for the most part. So oftentimes you may only get the first or second page. You'll see here at the top right-hand corner, there is an expiration date. That has to do with when the surveyor completes the elevation certificate. Once an elevation certificate is completed, signed, dated, and sealed, it never expires. So if you have one from 2016 or 2010 or 2000, as long as it's signed, sealed, and dated, and we have all that information and it's legible, we can absolutely still use that. We do run into time to time too where it's been faxed or scanned about 100 times, and unfortunately we can't even read it anymore. And we hate to rate on something like that because ultimately we could be giving someone incorrect rates in those cases. The current elevation certificate, I think they just recently updated it, but this 2018 one ran for quite some time after November 30th, 2018. FEMA kept putting an extension on it because they didn't have a new form ready. So oftentimes, even the date or the signature may be after the expiration date at the top, and that's fine too. If that's rare occasions, and again, there happened to be an extension this last time. You can see here that it is actually a fillable PDF if you pull the elevation certificate off the National Flood Insurance Program website. I always kept it on hand in case a customer needed a copy or you want to show them kind of what they're looking for. You can keep that PDF on hand. If you're lucky and you get a new fillable PDF version, oftentimes it's typed, it's very legible, it's easy to read and follow. But oftentimes you may get an older version that's handwritten, and that's okay too. Section A is going to be information about the property itself. And this is really important. Again, the name does not have to reflect the current owner. That's okay. But you do want to make sure that the property address matches. And we run into this from time to time where there's been a U.S. Postal Service address change or a 911 address change, and that property address on paper no longer reflects the legal property address for the property we're working on. In that case, we as the agent would just have to attest that the properties are the same. If we're lucky, Section A3 property description may have a parcel number or a lot number that's very easily identifiable and easy for us to prove. Unfortunately, sometimes it was brand new construction when it was built. Like in this case, it may only say lot 45, something that's not really helpful for us to identify that property. You can see here we've got examples of how the address has changed over time, or maybe how we enter the address incorrectly as we're quoting the policy. It's important to note, and we talk about this a lot on our quoting webinars, but how we enter the property into the system will ultimately impact the flood zone determination or the flood zone result we get back. So it's important to note that if we're entering an address into the system, we want to make sure that it's correct. Now, in this case, if the elevation certificate is the one that's incorrect, that's fine. We can speak to that and attest to that later. But if it's supposed to be South President Street and we just enter President Street, we may get a completely incorrect flood zone determination, which ultimately impacts the rating on the policy. So we always want to make sure that the property address is accurately reflected on our application process. And I just had some feedback in the chat. You were recently able to buy a house and the realtor was able to get the elevation certificate from the town. That's fantastic. So in that case, the community actually kept the elevation certificate on hand. I think the communities are getting better and better at that, but I always think that's a great place to start if you're trying to track one down. Right. Thank you for the feedback. It's really helpful. Section A also talks about photograph requirements. And the reason these photos are so important is because oftentimes homeowners make changes to the structure after the elevation certificate's done. And what FEMA wants to see is that what's on paper still accurately reflects the actual building. So what we find most commonly is the homes that begin up on stilts on the coast. Over time, that lower area underneath the house, the stilt area, becomes enclosed. They want storage or additional living space or garage space or whatever the case is. Well, that house was built up on stilts for a reason. And the theory is that the water would pass right underneath without causing severe damage. Well, now we've enclosed that space underneath and the water's just going to be hitting a wall, which could cause severe foundation damage. So what FEMA wants to see is if we say it's a basement or elevated without an enclosure or crawl space or whatever the case is, that's accurately reflected in the photos. The photos have to be taken within 90 days. In our old system, it's helpful to actually put something with that stated that they were taken within the last 90 days. For those of you that have rolled onto our new quoting platform, Trident, you can actually attest to that in the quote, which is really helpful, kind of alleviate that step in the process. Don't worry though, if you haven't rolled onto Trident yet, you will by the end of the year. It's really great. So make sure those photos are taken within the last 90 days. Make sure that they're the entire structure. So I'm actually going to show you our next slide here. You want to make sure that you can see the bottom of the foundation all the way to the roof line in that picture. So in this case, I can clearly see from the ground all the way to the roof line on both sides. And you can see on one side, it looks like it's fully enclosed. But when you go around the back, it's not. It's only a partial enclosure. And that's why these photos are so important. So you also see on the far right-hand side, the person has taken an additional picture to show that it's open all the way through except for that small enclosure. Any additional photos like that are very, very helpful. As long as you can get a clear photo of the front and the back showing foundation to roof, we should be okay. But once you've got those two, you can absolutely take additional photos of the enclosure, of the foundation. While you're there, get as many pictures as you think would be relevant, and that way it'll save you time in the back end when underwriting has additional questions. And again, you can take these with your phone and upload them as well, or email them to yourself. They don't have to be professional photos, they just have to be clear and show the entire structure. And I know I have some underwriters on this call, so if I am speaking out of turn or from the underwriting group, if there's anything that we can do to provide agents with additional information around some of this, please let me know as I'm teaching. Here's some examples of non-compliant photos. So unfortunately, we're not allowed to use Zillow or Google. There were some accommodations made during COVID, or we're actually able to use some online photos during that time because they understood that it was difficult for people to get out and take photos. But historically, the program does not want photos off the internet. We don't know if they're accurate. We can't verify it's the correct property. We don't always know the exact date the photo was taken, etc. So it is really important to make sure you're actually going out and taking these photos. If you can get your policyholder to take them with their phone and email or text them to you, that's great. And you can see the photo at the bottom right. Not only is it from online, but again, it doesn't show us the structure of the house at all. It just shows this nice, beautiful pool that this person's lucky enough to have. So it's not really helpful for what we need anyway. You can see here too, the fence obscures the foundation. And what we really need to see is what that foundation looks like behind there. I mean, for all we know, it's lattice or it's solid wall. It's hard to say. These can be incredibly difficult when the fence is this close to the structure. If you can, open that door behind the trash can and just take a picture straight down that fence line so that we can see inside the fence. This floor to ceiling or floor to roof Picture is helpful, but we would need additional information from inside the fence in order to complete this application process. You can also see the garage doors open on the lower right-hand side. Doesn't hurt to go in there and take a picture as well, because if there are openings or lattice, flood vents, etc., you would see those on the inside of the garage as well. Section A7 is really what these photos are designed to show us as well. So this has to do with crawl space or enclosure size and finishings, as well as flood vents. So you want to make sure that this information accurately reflects the property. So we're going to have to know how big the crawl space is or how big the enclosure is underneath the home. But if there are any flood vents or flood openings, we're going to need photos of those as well. Flood vents and flood openings can greatly reduce premium on the property. So sometimes when the elevation certificate is completed, the customer has not put flood vents in their home. They can absolutely go back and add flood venting later if the property is eligible, take photos and provide the vent information, and we can add that to the policy with the supporting documentation. So just because it's not done at the time of the elevation certificate doesn't mean they're out of luck. It's also important to note too, many of the flood vent companies have specific information around make and models of flood vents because they all move different amounts of water. And oftentimes a homeowner may hire an engineer or a flood vent expert to help install those in the home so that they have the right amount of venting. But understanding the serial number, make and model is also really important so that we can accurately apply that information to the underwriting and the rates. And here is the dreaded lowest floor guide. And I am so sorry because I know this is so confusing from time to time to have to work through this. Many of you know in our quoting system, when we ask you the foundation type and you click on that option, you're going to see many of these enclosure types pop up. You can also reach out, you click on our website and we've got materials there as well. But ultimately what we're trying to determine is what the foundation of the structure looks like, whether it's a basement or a crawl space, or maybe it's an above grade crawl space or elevated with or without an enclosure. Couple things to remember. Basements and below grade crawl spaces are below ground on all four sides. The difference is really how deep below ground they go. So I believe the rule of thumb is more than 4 feet below ground on all four sides is considered a basement, and above that's considered a crawl space. And you have to think, if the water's going to come into that space, it's going to fill up like a swimming pool or a bathtub and could potentially cause a lot of damage to the structure and the foundation. And that's why we're required to rate from that level. So unfortunately, it doesn't do a lot for the homeowner if we're rating from the basement floor, because you have to think how far below ground that goes. But at the same time, that's most likely where they're going to sustain damage and loss. So really, FEMA does try to do a good job of keeping these foundations up to date with change in construction. Slab stem walls, which is 1B, was something that was added in the last 5 years. And those are the new construction type we're starting to see, where it's a slab, but it's a really, really thick slab in a way for them to inexpensively get the house up off the ground. If you guys have any questions about any of this as we go, please feel free to throw them in the chat box as well. So here's an example of crawl space information and venting information. So you'll see here that we've indicated it's building diagram 8, the below grade crawl space. We're saying that the elevation certificate is saying that there's 6 openings for a total opening of 768 square inches. So you're literally taking the dimensions of the flood vent, multiplying them and figuring out what the square inches of openings there are. You need at least 1 inch of square opening for every square foot of space in order for those flood vents to be applicable. You can see here the app doesn't accurately reflect the information on the elevation certificate. These don't match up. This will be an underwriting error. So if for whatever reason the information the insured is providing us no longer matches with the elevation certificate, again, we're going to have supporting documentation to resolve this discrepancy. Otherwise, FEMA will not let us use it. It's important to note that FEMA audits files. Ultimately, they're the underwriting house or the reinsurer behind the National Flood Insurance Program, and they want to make sure we're accurately underwriting these policies. I know sometimes it probably feels like underwriting is being a little bit of a stickler, but it is very important that we make sure the policy is correct, because ultimately at the time of a loss, if the adjuster gets out there and this information doesn't match the structure that they're looking at, it could potentially stop the claims process, and the policy has to be correctly re-underwritten and possibly additional premium paid before the claim can be completed. The same with an attached garage. The elevation certificate here indicates there's an attached garage. The application doesn't provide the garage information, therefore the two do not match. You'll see section A9 does provide garage information, so hopefully that's accurately completed. Again, if that's something that was added later, that's information we'll need to know. But it is important to note too that if the garage is attached, oftentimes we have to rate from the garage floor, not the house floor. And as many of us know, especially up here up north, you step down into your garage. So that may adversely affect the policy as well. I got a great comment here in the chat box. Sometimes the ECs are incorrect. She's seen it where some of the doors and windows were counted as flood openings. Yes, that's very true. Surveyors and engineers aren't always flood savvy either, so kind of gives us a little street cred. But ultimately, in order for it to count for a flood vent, it has to have the ability to open and close with the force and weight of water without human intervention. So if I'm not at my house and there's a flooding event, my flood vents have to fully operate without me there to assist in that process. So a door or window is not going to open unless I open them, therefore they can't count as flood venting. So it's a very good point. Section B is going to be everything about the map information, the flood map information at the time the elevation certificate was completed. So you'll find that oftentimes this won't necessarily match the current map information for this property. Flood maps are updated very regularly, especially in high-risk areas or flood-prone areas. You'll see maps updated every couple years. And then there's some sections of the country that haven't seen a map update in 20 years. So it really just depends on where you and your customer are located at. But again, this is reflective of the flood information at the time the survey was completed. If this doesn't match current information, we have rules with FEMA as to which information we have to use. And sometimes if we need to grandfather, what information we can use. So don't despair if this doesn't match the current information, but maybe it's more beneficial. We may be able to prove a grandfathering situation and use the information anyway. So in those cases, please reach out to underwriting and we'll help you through that. So we want to make sure the insured gets obviously the best premium possible for what they're buying. B12 talks about properties located in a coastal barrier resource system area. These are protected federal areas, obviously highly flood prone areas. You see them sometimes off the coast of the Outer Bank or Sea Island, Georgia. These are going to be areas that are really essentially marsh islands. And in all the years I've done flood, I've seen 2 of these. And the property owners were very well versed that these were in CDRS zones because you're unable to obtain federal flood insurance in those areas. And I'll be honest, the private markets are not interested in writing you flood insurance when you're out in the middle of the ocean. So oftentimes these are cash purchases and not something that they're insuring through the NFIP. Section C is going to be kind of the nuts and bolts of what we need in order to rate a policy. So you're going to go through whether or not it's based on construction drawings, a building under construction, or finished construction. Construction drawings is usually new construction in a high-risk flood zone where the bank is requiring flood insurance during the construction process. So these elevation certificates for both construction drawings and a building under construction are almost always completed by an engineer or architect who's designing the property on the front end. The nice thing about construction drawing elevation certificates is that you can play with the numbers in the system a little bit. And what we found is if the customer elevates the structure another 6 inches or 1 foot, sometimes it can have a really positive impact on the long-term flood premium that they have to pay. And that's really helpful information before you break ground. Ultimately, if you have an elevation certificate based on construction drawings or a building under construction, you will have to have a final elevation certificate done when the building is complete. So those homeowners or property owners end up having 2 elevation certificates done. And that final one would be based on finished construction, and the photos would also have to reflect that finished construction. And that's really just to make sure that what we said it was going to look like at the beginning of construction is what it actually ended up looking like at the end. C1A through H is all the actual elevations of not only the lowest floor, so maybe the foundation or crawl space basement, but also the next higher floor. The amount of space between the foundation floor and the next higher floor can often tell us if it's a crawl space or a basement. So if you're telling me that the lowest floor is at 10 feet and the next higher floor is at 20 feet, that's a 10-foot difference. That's definitely bigger than a crawl space. I'm probably looking at elevated with an enclosure, elevated, or a basement in those cases. So sometimes you may enter the information and you may have entered it as a crawl space, and the system may want to change it to a basement, or it's erroring out on you and telling you your elevations don't match. And it could be a case like that where technically it's not a basement because you can't really stand up in it, but in the same regard, it's too big to be a technical crawl space. I hope that makes sense. So you're going to have this elevation information here. F and G relate to the ground around the outside of the structure. So the lowest adjacent grade is the ground around the outside of the house at the lowest point, and then the highest adjacent grade is the ground around the outside of the house at the highest point. This information here is also really important if you have a property owner looking to go through a map review process with FEMA. Maybe they built their structure up high enough or they truly believe their property shouldn't be in a high-risk flood zone, and they have an elevation certificate done to have it go through what we call the letter of map revision or letter of map amendment process, where they ask FEMA to review the information in this elevation certificate here, and based on the information they get back, maybe FEMA will put them into a low-risk BC or X zone and permanently remove that mandatory requirement for flood. So those are possibilities as well, and another benefit of an elevation certificate if the information turns out to be beneficial. If you have questions on a LOMA or LOMR process, please let us know. Could be the insurance agent hero of the year. Section D pertains to the person who completed the elevation certificate. This is where you're going to get the signed seal and signature of the surveyor, engineer, or architect who completed the document. It does have to be sealed in order for us to use it. We don't need the original seal document with the embossing where you can feel it. A scanned copy of that is just fine. Sometimes this information is helpful if you're missing pages, or if there's a discrepancy in the information, you need the surveyor to go back and re-review their work. Not always helpful, but I've called many a surveyor to ask lots of questions, and at least the information's there if you need it. Section E is actually for those rare flood zones where the homeowner can do the elevation certificate themselves. Again, you can see there's far fewer elevations to measure, and they give them many options for the type of measurement they use, whether it be feet or meters. But oftentimes, the average homeowner or property owner is going to get confused about highest adjacent grade, lowest adjacent grade, the difference between the two. So if they need help with something like this, please let us know, because we can help get them information, or maybe they can even work with a local community official to complete one of these. Section F is where the person signs off that they've done this themselves, and we have that information on record as well. Section G is where you have a community official complete your elevation certificate. And again, it's the same flood zones as which the homeowner can complete it. Also makes me nervous. Not that community officials don't know what they're doing, but if you're not well equipped in measuring for flood elevations, you may struggle a little bit with completing an elevation certificate. If the community official is the person that fills out the form, they are required to fill out this section and sign and date it as well. So it's important that they complete this. Now, if you're in an area where you have a savvy floodplain manager or community official, then absolutely go this route. It might be a lot less expensive than a surveyor. And again, these are, I'm going to go back to section E. These are going to be for zones AO and plain A in flood zones that don't have a base flood elevation. That's what BFE stands for. So there's no base elevation or height that we're looking to be at or above defined for this area, and therefore you can complete this yourself. So
Courtney, you did have a question about applying to the LOMA to remove the structure? Or are you saying the EC, if the EC indicates it's eligible, it'll be removed without a request?
That's a great question. No, so if it's not an automatic notification process to FEMA. So let me go back to the elevation certificate. Oops, I apologize. I'm sure I'm making you guys dizzy here. My understanding of the LOMA, letter of map amendment or letter of map revision process, is you need your lowest adjacent grade here, the ground around the outside of the structure, to be above the established base flood elevation for the area. So if you feel your property sits high enough, maybe your piece of land is rather low lying in a high risk flood zone, but you've built your house up and it sits above the rest of that land, then there might be a decent chance that the lowest adjacent grade around the structure is above the base flood elevation. But the only way to know is to have an official elevation certificate done. So you may end up spending the money on an elevation certificate in the chance that you can apply to FEMA. So once you get the elevation certificate and you've established what the elevations for your structure in the ground are, you send it off to FEMA with some additional paperwork. I want to say it takes about 6 to 8 weeks for the review process to be completed, and then they will respond to the property owner. Once that review process is complete, they will actually officially change the flood map. So when I go to run that flood zone determination on that property again in the future, I'm going to go back a couple slides, it reflects in the flood zone determination. So oftentimes a flood zone determination looks like this. Here in the middle gives me the flood zone. There's actually one more box on an actual flood zone determination that says LOMA, LOMER, question mark. And in this case, it would say yes with the letter of map amendment date there. So you may find a B7 here, a revised effective date based on that LOMA process. And now every time you run that flood zone determination in the future, until the next map change, it will come up that low risk flood zone. So it is not an automatic process. I always tell property owners, you are taking a risk by purchasing an elevation certificate, because if we find that the information is not favorable, you're not going to get a refund on that. But it is truly the only chance to permanently get yourself out of a high risk flood zone. And you have some people that are absolutely adamant that they should not be paying for high risk flood insurance premium, and they're willing to go down this road. You can also look up existing LOMA and LOMER information online at the NFIP website. If you're unable to find it when you run information, you can actually find old LOMER and LOMA information online as well. Great question. So I know I've skipped around in slides like crazy, and I'm probably making you all dizzy. But that was our elevation certificate class for today. I don't want to make it any longer for you guys because this is a lot of information to absorb in a quick, short amount of time. But know that we have a lot of resources available for you. Please email the team if you're working with a specific elevation certificate or property issue. We can either help you or get you to the right people who can help you. We have experts on staff who work on these things all day. And I'm ready for any questions you guys might have, hopefully. I know this is dry, right? Flood puns. Okay, so I know Carrie and Tori are helping me manage the chat box, but I have one here. It says, if you get an elevation certificate and it's worse or maybe not favorable, does it change the rate? No, if we're not required to apply an elevation certificate, we don't have to. So if they obtain an elevation certificate and it's not beneficial to their rates, at this point, not all properties are required to have one for rating purposes, so we won't use it. In that case, depending on the structure of the home, we may be able to point them in the right direction on how they can modify their structure moving forward to make it maybe a little more favorable, but we don't have to apply it if it's not necessary. Oh, and thank you all so much for the kind words. I really enjoy teaching all of you every day. I'm a total flood nerd, I'm sure, as you can tell. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And please join us for game week next week. We're so excited to try something new to test your flood knowledge. Oh, I have somebody else who said they love flood insurance too. Janice, my flood geek guru friend. I love it. Yes, and I'll tell you, from agent to agent, if you can get good at flood insurance, it can be really lucrative too, because a lot of agents avoid it and they don't want to write it. And I'll tell you what, these policy holders have to go somewhere. So have them come to you, become that expert for sure. I have another, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, you had one other question. In what instance it helps getting an EC for pre-firm properties?
That's a really good question. So oftentimes basements and below grade crawl spaces sit so far below ground. It's rare on older homes that elevation certificates are going to help. I don't want to say always, because sometimes if you're up on a hill, we might get lucky. But you have to think, if we're going to go below ground in the basement to rate your property, there's a good chance it's going to sit pretty low. So maybe if it's on an above grade crawl space or a slab or even elevated, on older structures, we might get lucky that they sit high enough that an elevation certificate is beneficial. It's just in below grade crawl spaces and basements where we struggle to get beneficial rates on older structures. Great question. I got another question. Was this recorded? Yes, I'm getting so much better at remembering to record these. We will post it on our website. I will send all of you the material as well and some links to the National Flood Insurance Program website on where to find elevation certificates and map information. And if you're getting in there and you want to get better at this and you want to learn how to work with these policies, please let us know and we can help you on a one-on-one basis as well. Oh, and I have a flood-only agent on the phone. I'm sure you have a lot of people coming to you for information, so good for you. I love that.
Courtney, we also had a question about if they're going to get notifications for game day challenges.
Yes, so emails should be coming out from our marketing department around how to enroll for game day, game week. You can also go to our website under agent training and enroll for any of the games that you might be interested in participating in. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, emails will go out in the morning with the app for Kahoot, as well as the game code you need to participate. And check out our leaderboard, because we're going to have prizes not only for participants, but also for our leaderboard. So we're really excited about it. Oh, and I had another comment. So in Houston, about 50% of the pre-firm properties that obtain an elevation certificate see an improvement in premium. So in that case, I'm assuming in Houston, there's probably not a lot of basements. It's probably more slab and maybe crawl space because of proximity to the ocean, but I'm not sure there. Don't quote me on that. So, but yeah, so in that case, in Andrea's case, it sounds like elevation certificates do help from time to time. So, and yes, it can be worth the money. And in areas too where the ground is more flat, the elevation certificates are more affordable. I've seen cases in the mountains in West Virginia where it's $3,000 to obtain an elevation certificate because of the topography. So it really depends on where you are, for sure.
Courtney, you had a question from Joanne about what if the prior owner does not want to provide a copy of the policy?
Oh, do they want to sell their house? No, I'm just joking. That was a smart answer. I'm sorry. You know, we run across weird situations like that from time to time. They are under no obligation to either transfer their policy to you or to give you the elevation certificate. But if they're in the process of selling the property, it's really rare that you're going to find someone who won't provide you with the information, unless they know maybe their policy is rated incorrectly. And they may tell you, oh yeah, you only pay $500 a year here for flood insurance, when in reality that's probably not the case. So again, it's rare, but they aren't obligated to provide it, unfortunately. Hopefully the realtors can duke it out. People do strange stuff sometimes. I don't always have the answer for that stuff. I got another question about the games. It looks like, yeah, so some of the days have the same game twice a day, just to give you guys an opportunity to join. So please don't feel like you have to come twice a day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Any other questions?
I think that's it, Courtney.
Awesome. This was great. I love all the questions. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, Tori. Thanks, Carrie, for manning the chat and the questions. And please feel free to reach out if you guys need anything further. And I'm going to go ahead and dismiss you if I don't see anything else. All right, guys, you're free to go. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.